Well, I want to start off by sharing a little bit about myself. I didn't do that in the last session on purpose. And am I getting feedback? I'm hearing feedback. Did it sound okay to you, or good? Okay. All right. I didn't share that on purpose in the last session because I figured we're going to talk about the SBC, and the whole reason that I'm doing what I'm doing right now is basically because of the SBC. And I didn't wake up one morning and think, like, I just want to go talk about things that I hate and write books about it and spend all my time researching it. That wasn't in the life plan. But what happened with me is I was at a Southern Baptist Seminary, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. And I checked out the campus in 2014, and it was great, I thought. My tour was awesome. I checked out a few other schools, and Southeastern was really the place that I wanted to go. I really sensed that they were the missions school, and that's what they were known for at the time. I think now they're more known as the social justice school, which is sad to me. And so I went, and I had a pretty decent time the first semester, but I did notice one thing, it wasn't presented to me when I first entered the school, but in attending, I just saw in the chapels, there were a lot of speakers that they brought in from other places who weren't Southern Baptist. And I also noticed the ones who weren't Southern Baptist tend to be African American speakers who would come and sometimes share things about literally just the history of like the Black experience. Sometimes we wouldn't even open our Bible. It would just be, this is African American history. And it was a curious thing to me, but I didn't really think a lot of it. I just thought it's weird. Like, I don't understand this emphasis. It's just strange. I came here to know the Bible. That's why I'm here. And my roommates felt the same way about it. And I had left the college for, I guess, 2 years and came back. I actually got married. I came back to the campus, and I arrived in the summer of 2017, so it's right after Donald Trump was elected. And I could barely recognize the institution that I had been at previously. I just thought, this can't be the same seminary. What was different? Well, there was an entity I'll talk about a little bit later called the Initiative, or the Kingdom Diversity Initiative, that had actually been started in 2013, but it really wasn't doing much until, I guess, 2016, 2017. And they were constantly hosting events, podcasts, putting out blogs that were essentially promoting ideas adjacent to critical race theory and liberation theology. And I remember one event that they held to essentially support the kneelers and understand the people kneeling at the football games. They were against the monuments. They wanted them to come down in North Carolina at the time. That was a controversy. There was just, I remember I was logging into my student account, and they have, right beside it, the blogs that the school would put out. And they had one from the Intersect Project, which was another kind of new think tank that I don't think was there when I was there before. And it had a blog that talked about the 8 ways or something. I think it was 8. The 8 ways you're racist and don't realize it. And I'm like, well, I want to know. So I clicked on it, and I sat down with my wife, and it was stuff like, if your place of employment is mainly white, or you live in a community that's mainly white. And I'm thinking, that's Southeastern. They're racist then by this standard. And so there was all kinds of things just like that. There was 3 statements made in just the 2017 fall semester alone against Donald Trump or the alt-right, either originating at the school or heavily supported by professors and the staff. And there was nothing in 8 years of Obama. I thought, this is strange. It's just strange. And pretty soon, things started changing. Curriculum started changing. They have now, there's a program you can actually get if you're in undergrad, it's basically a social justice degree, but it's ethics and justice degree. And you'll take courses in the environment and courses in racism and race and theology. I can't remember the names of all the courses, but you look at the course listings, and these weren't there in 2014. I mean, this is a Bible school. That's what it was known for. And now there's a drift going on. There's a shifting going on. And there's so many other things I could point to just show the difference. And so that got me to thinking, why is this happening? So while I was there, I went to a professor that we had kind of drawn the proverbial ichthys fish, like early church where they draw the fish, like, I'm a Christian, and the guy would draw the fish. So this guy dropped a few hints, and I'm like, I think he supported Trump, or did support Trump. And so I'm like, I think he's safe. So I went to his office, and I just said, hey, I would like to talk to you about what's happening on campus. What do you mean? I'm like, well, this just social justice push, and this is, condemning everyone for being racist. And he goes, shut the door. So I did. And I said, of course, now I'm like leaning in, and he's like whispering to me. So I'm thinking like there's KGB agents around the corner or something. And he's telling me, and this is sad to me, but he's telling me that my observations are correct, that he sees it. He told me some other professors who see the same problem, but that I should not do anything about it. It'd be bad for me, basically. Don't say a thing about it. He said that if he were to say something about it, he would be fired. And it shocked me because this was a professor. This wasn't an adjunct. This was someone who had been there a while. And I kind of left there confused, I remember, after that meeting. And I kept thinking to myself, well, someday someone's going to say something. This can't go on forever because it just keeps getting worse. And no one did. It grieves me to say the professors that I knew at the time who were against this, who didn't say anything about it, who wouldn't say anything about it, have either all left or retired, or their contracts weren't renewed if they're adjuncts. They're all gone. None of them are at the seminary. And I could speculate on the reasons for that, but that's not what I'm here to do today. The problem, as you'll see as we go through this, is not that there's social justice in the Southern Baptist Convention. I don't think that's actually the root issue that I have a problem with. I would expect there to be some social justice in the Southern Baptist Convention today, just because it's everywhere else. You can't, it's going to leak in. It's going to threaten your organization. The problem that I have is where are all the shepherds who are supposed to be guarding the sheep in the Southern Baptist Convention? How come it seems like the immune system isn't working? And when a pathogen comes in, it just gets to replicate all at once, and now we have a cancer, and we're in stage 4. In fact, it may even be past that. I hate to say it. So for those who've listened to the podcast, my fuller thoughts on all this, and I don't mean to sound so dismal and discouraging at the outset, but so let me put things in perspective. After you take the proverbial, what do they call it now, the red pill, after you figure out kind of what's going on, and it does take a lot of work, and I've spent thousands of hours at this point, you realize, though, that the kingdom of God is bigger than the Southern Baptist Convention, okay? So that's the encouraging part. God's kingdom didn't go anywhere, even if the Southern Baptist Convention wants to go off a cliff. And there are faithful people in the Southern Baptist Convention who still don't know what's going on. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to share with you. And why would you? You're doing your thing. You're living your life. You're going to church. You're assuming the money you give to missions and stuff is going to that end. And you wouldn't, know about any of this going on unless it probably hits you in the face in like a national media report or something. So once you do some digging, and I encourage you all, if you're curious about this, I can point you to some places to dig, then you start to realize there's a problem, but that, God's kingdom is moving on. He's going to use the weak things to shame the strong. That's how he likes doing that kind of thing. He doesn't need the Southern Baptist Convention. And I know some people in this room, because I've heard, are contemplating whether they should stay or whether they should leave. And so hopefully this will help you figure that out. I don't want to really push you in one direction, but spoiler alert, I tend to lean towards have a deadline, have some expectations, an ultimatum of some kind. This is what we expect. And then if it doesn't happen, then you got to consider maybe leaving. And I'll give you the reasons for that at the end. But I can't make that determination for anyone in this room. So it's very difficult to take this huge problem. Because I was thinking about this this week when I was considering what to say. There's so many moving parts, and there's so many things that have happened in the last few years. To boil it all down is extremely difficult. So I'm going to try to skip over the surface and give you some high points as much as I can. And in the Q&A, hopefully we can get to more specifics if you have questions. So I'll start here. many Southern Baptists are wondering what happened to their organization. How did a denomination that escaped the grip of modern liberalism in the 1980s accept a postmodern derivative 40 years later? Because that's what's happening. And I think the reason that people are questioning that, or started to question that, is something called Resolution 9. How many of you know what Resolution 9 is? Okay, so all right, good. So I don't think people questioned the Southern Baptist Convention much before that happened. And that was in 2019. And so since then, there's been some mistrust has been created. But I want to remind everyone that there's two basic categories here to look at, to examine. There's false teaching on the one end, and then there's corruption on the other. And I would expect this because Jesus warned that the Pharisees had hypocrisy, but they were also power hungry, and they were greedy. He talked about those things going hand in hand. Peter warned that false teachers not only introduced destructive heresies, but also practiced sensuality, greed, and deception. So we see these two things running parallel courses. And I would submit to you, I think there's a relationship here. I think that one comes with the other. Now, the difficulty here is that there is incomplete information to some extent. Even though there's a lot of information, there's a lot of the private meetings and stuff where decisions have been made in the Southern Baptist Convention are behind closed doors. And even some things that I know, I can't share publicly because they're not publicly available, and the people who share them, I can't, they warn me, you can't say anything or else I'll get fired. I mean, I get that kind of thing happens a lot. And so there's a lot of fear of retribution if you share what's happening behind closed doors. So I'm going to give you publicly available information, but I think it'll give you a representative picture, which is really what we need. All right, Resolution 9. This happened in 2019. The convention voted to adopt the critical race theory and intersectionality as analytical tools which could aid in evaluating a variety of human experiences. However, the truth is that in some prominent areas of the convention, these tools were already being used. When this happened in 2019, it was a shock to a lot of people who were paying attention. It wasn't a shock to me. I thought, well, that's just what they've been doing at Southeastern for the last few years. I'm going to give you some information here about critical race theory, and this is primary source stuff. I can give you all the info if you're interested. In 2015, Dr. Jarvis Williams, a professor of New Testament interpretation at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, credited critical race theorists for some of his own understandings on race and encouraged Christians to glean insights from the ideology. Williams argued in his contribution to the highly acclaimed 2017 book, Removing the Stain of Racism from the SBC, that teachings consistent with CRT were necessary for accomplishing racial reconciliation in the denomination. Unsurprisingly, his concept of racial reconciliation incorporated every significant aspect of critical race theory. Let me give you an example. Williams taught that every ethno-racial group outside of faith in Jesus Christ is a racist group. You're all racists. That race is a construct that people created for advancing a racist agenda. That privilege and whiteness keep minorities without a voice in the Southern Baptist Convention. Even though he's anyway. You can't make this stuff up. That the colorblind theory of race is a myth. That certain predominantly white churches want a multi-ethnic church as long as they are not required to share privilege and power with black and brown people. So even people who want diversity in their church, you got to view with suspicion because maybe they just want it to look good. They're still racists. That white people need to learn the narrative of different ethnic and marginalized groups to access certain truth, standpoint epistemology. And that critical race theory and social identity theory are helpful tools for understanding identity formation in what? The New Testament. So we need critical race theory to help us understand the Bible. Yet Williams was not alone in his analysis. He wasn't off over here and he's the only one saying these things. Dr. Curtis Woods, also at Southern Seminary, eventually chaired the committee that proposed Resolution 9, and he used critical race theory as an analytical lens to understand the intersectionality of religion, race, class, and gender in his 2018 dissertation from the school. So he went to Southern Seminary, had a dissertation, said, this is what I used to help me arrive at the conclusions of my dissertation. And He was the chairman of the committee that gave us Resolution 9 in the Southern Baptists. Woods likewise publicly expressed his appreciation for another Southern professor, Dr. Matthew Hall, for his deep understanding of critical race theory. This is all public. Hall taught that simply growing up in the United States conferred a racialized worldview that subconsciously formed one's values. In 2018, he declared himself to be a racist because he lived in a culture where he benefited from racism. Now, that kind of analysis was increasing in the Southern Baptist Convention in 2009, 18, 19, even if it didn't go by the name critical race theory. I'll give you an example of that. 2 months after David Platt resigned from the Southern Baptist Convention's International Mission Board, he delivered a famous keynote at the 2018 Together for the Gospel Conference, in which he argued that he, along with white Christians in attendance, were guilty of racism for ignoring the injustice present in racial disparities, practicing colorblindness, and failing to confront injustice and diversify. Platt even insinuated that the church was more responsible than the world for propagating racism. Prominent Southern Baptist Convention pastor Mark Dever spoke to the same audience on a panel focused on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. He discouraged them from using the phrase, "Make America Great Again." He encouraged them to rethink black history. He declared George Washington a non-Christian, yet treated Martin Luther King Jr. as a believer who exemplified a deeply Christian understanding of love. The week before T4G, so this is happening all around the same time, this is before Resolution 9, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the ERLC, sponsored the MLK 50 Summit in Memphis, where white Christians repented for racism and speakers encouraged attendees to submit to black voices and use their influence to fight systemic racism. Russell Moore, who served as the president of the ERLC, insinuated that American evangelicals lack the full gospel. We talked about that before, because they failed to confront systemic sin. Now, here's the thing. I was at Southeastern at the time. The Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Southeastern both offered course credit to students who wanted to attend that conference. I could have gone to that conference and gotten 3 credits for attending and doing some coursework that Russell Moore gave me towards my degree, in which it would qualify me to serve as a pastor. Now, those are just a few examples of what was happening and what was in the water before Resolution 9 even happened. And I'll give you some examples of afterward. A good place to start, though, because I think the question is, where did this come from? How did this just come out of nowhere? A good place to start, I think, is, and I don't think I've ever even said this on the podcast, so this is new information for even podcast listeners, is looking at the Great Commission Resurgence Report of 2010. Some of you in the SBC may remember that 12 years ago. In 2008, the convention declared or elected Pastor Johnny Hunt to be president. And during the same annual meeting, they passed a resolution encouraging all entities of the Southern Baptist Convention to strive toward a balanced representation of our ethnic diversity and encourage the president, Johnny Hunt, and all committees to work with state conventions and local associations to identify ethnic leadership from cooperating Southern Baptist churches to serve on boards, committees, and programs of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, that seems pretty innocuous. It seems like, what's the problem there? I think, though, that's where the seeds of this were sown. You could probably go before that if you wanted, but this is where we start seeing this reorientation of the mission of the church from reaching all kinds of different people from different ethnicities to, as an end in and of itself, diversifying and making sure we look diverse. We see this shift happening, and that's where I think it starts. The next year, Hunt appointed a task force intended to evaluate and propose solutions to the SBC's numerical decline. One contributor to the report, president of Southern Seminary, Albert Mohler, predicted that if the denomination failed to do the hard work of achieving ethnic diversity, it would diminish. So it's going to be doomed for the SBC. We're already losing people. We're losing members. If we don't diversify, then we won't be a convention anymore. We'll be wiped off the face of the planet. So it's literally the survival of the convention depends on ethnic diversity. This was the drumbeat. Mohler proposed forming a, quote, incredible strategy to become more diverse in order to survive these demographic trends and keep from standing out from the culture. It was not long after this report that strategies to diversify ethnically took root in the seminaries. So here's the order. Seminaries,
then church planting, and then finally the mission field. And if I could add an addendum, the ERLC behind all of it. But it started really in the seminaries and the ERLC as well. Here's what Southeastern's Kingdom Diversity Initiative looked like in 2013. They had the goal of fostering ethnic and gender diversity within the seminary, the church, and the denomination. One of the major ways the initiative worked toward this goal was offering special grants and scholarships for non-white and non-male students to help meet certain quotas that increase the percentage of non-white and non-male students, staff, and faculty. So they literally had percentages of, I think for women, they wanted, staff, students, and faculty to be like 35% women by a certain date. That's the kind of thing they were really reaching for. It was quotas. Danny Akins denied this, but it's on the website. Danny Akins, by the way, is the president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. The application also included questions, the application to qualify for a diversity scholarship included questions like this. How have you recently promoted multiculturalism in your church or educational context? In what ways do you believe you could contribute to fostering a multiracial and cultural community at Southeastern? So the significance of this is that, and it gives you a clue into the thinking behind this, kingdom diversity meant promoting a message as well as reaching a quota. So it wasn't enough to be, let's say you were Hispanic and you got a kingdom diversity scholarship. It wasn't enough to be Hispanic to get the scholarship. You had to answer questions about, and how are you going to be promoting a multicultural agenda at our seminary once you get here? That's they were looking for activists to come in. It wasn't just looking for different kinds of people from different ethnicities. They wanted people of a certain persuasion who thought a certain way to come in. This is one of the ways that Walter Strickland ended up getting exposed. Now, I'm going to kind of shorten this. There's so much that could be said, but Walter Strickland is a professor at the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I believe he's a false teacher. I've said it many times. Walter Strickland believes in liberation theology. He denies it, but he definitely does. And he had a number of podcasts that he had put out with the Center for Kingdom Diversity that are since then scrubbed, in which he praised James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology. And this became kind of a big deal around the time of Resolution 9. Only a few people were talking about it. James White on the Dividing Line podcast was talking about it. But it was kind of crazy that he's praising this heretic who's LGBT accommodating and all of that. And Walter Strickland, if you dig into the various podcasts and public things that he's put out there, you'll find he does what I talked about in the last session. He conflates the law with the gospel. He's even said that loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor is the gospel. That's the law. That's the law that condemns us. The gospel is the good news that because even though we don't do that, Jesus has paid the penalty for us. So he's conflated that, but that's the kind of mistake you would think a liberation theologian would make. He has praised J. Dietis Roberts as well, who he said that his favorite book is a book by J. Dietis Roberts that the book condemns the Bible-based gospel and promotes the teachings of Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx. It's very radical stuff once you start digging into everything. Now, the thing that I think caught a lot of people's attention was, I think, either end of 2019 or beginning of 2020, the New York Times came out with an article, and this is because it was in national media, so people saw it, where they interviewed Walter Strickland, and he said that he taught James Cone, but he did so kind of covertly. He wouldn't tell the students that what he was giving them was James Cone's teachings. And that became a rallying cry, that what is going on? We have Resolution 9, adopting critical race theory as an analytical tool, and now we have a professor at one of our most prominent seminaries publicly telling the New York Times they're teaching James Cone. What is going on here? Now, that's one example. I could probably give you like 4 or 5 names of professors at Southeastern who are all on that social justice train, like Walter Strickland. He's just the most prominent. But Southeastern is full of people who think this way. Other seminaries have the same issue. It's not unique to Southeastern. That's what I thought initially. I'm like, well, my school's kind of out there. But once people find out what's happening at Southeastern, well, no, it's happening other places. New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary also has their own diversity policy, which is very similar to the Kingdom Diversity Initiative. They even a few years ago, they had a segregated job fair. I remember because a friend of mine was on campus. He took pictures of it. He said, you can't go if you're not black and get a job. It is hosted at New Orleans. Southern Seminary. Similar stuff happening. Al Mohler has constantly been harping on, up until recently at least, the fact that they are adding diverse faculty members. They had a $5 million scholarship in 2020 that they gave, and you could only get it if you were black. And it was in the context of, this is it almost seemed like reparations. This is because of the legacy of the seminary from the past. We didn't have black people coming, so now we're going to give $5 million to this. Gateway Seminary, same kind of thing. North American Mission Board, multiple articles. You can just type in NAM diversity. It'll come up. So you see these initiatives all over the place. And I think a lot of the CRT stuff kind of blossomed out of that. That was the ground in which it was able to grow. You see in NAM the great requirement from the Ascend Institute. Dottie Lewis, who's high up in NAM, or was until recently, said that in order to preach the full gospel, you needed to preach the great requirement, which was doing justice. And if you don't do that, then you don't have the gospel. Again, classic conflation of law and grace. This is happening all over the place. There's also on the local church level, we see signs of this same thing happening. I don't know if any of you have seen, it's on YouTube, the FBC Naples documentary. Anyone seen that? A few of you, okay. So I was there for that, and man, those people, I talked to the people who weren't willing to go on camera, who were just crying. It was so heartbreaking, but there was a scenario where you had a big mega church in Florida, and they had a woke pastor come who was not qualified according to their constitution, but it was supported by Kevin Ezell at the North American Mission Board, literally playing a clip from him in the church to support this guy. Marcus Hayes was his name, and other bigwigs in the Southern Baptist Convention. And the church ended up, they didn't vote for him. There was enough people who saw that he was endorsing woke church and he was retweeting Kamala Harris and all this kind of stuff that they said, we can't have this guy. And they were all called racist, and they were disciplined from the church. And it's a tragic story, and it got really dirty. But I know that that's not the only church this happened. This kind of thing happened. I have a number of smaller churches I know about that just haven't made the headlines. There's been countless resolutions against racism in the Southern Baptist Convention as well. So you see this at the local church level. McLean Bible Church, by the way, another one that has the same issue. I mean, they have a pastor, an associate pastor there, who talks about how hard it is because he struggles with fantasizing about killing white people. I mean, it's insane. So the local church, the denominational level, every year, it seems like since, I think, about 2010, every time they meet, they have to renew some kind of a statement against racism again and again and again, like the priests in Hebrews, sacrificing all the time and never getting forgiveness. There's countless resolutions, countless resolutions against racism. There was the George Floyd statement that was made in 2020, which I think every entity had signed it, which linked the killing of George Floyd to police brutality or police systemic racism among the police in this country, and it's buying into that whole narrative. And that's just the CRT stuff, and that's the tip of the iceberg, and that's why this is so hard for me, because I'm like running out of time, but like I could just sit here all day and just tell you story after story after story. There's a lot of other issues, though, in the Southern Baptist Convention. We have a corruption of the pro-life movement going on right now, ethically. The ERLC has been championing this for years. I don't know when the first time they did was. I know by 2015 they certainly were, because they put on a conference about pro-life, and they had speakers there saying, well, there's like 15 pro-life issues. Smoking's a pro-life issue. Every cause of the left seems to be, not every, but a lot of the causes of the left seem to be pro-life issues. And on the right, you just have abortion. So when you weigh in the balance, who's more pro-life? David Platt made this argument in his book on voting from 2 years ago. So that's going on. You have some people have focused on this, Enemies Within the Church, which I have some copies of that DVD back there, talk a little bit about dark money coming in. It's not really dark, but it's they focus on the Kern Family Foundation. I will say that the Southeastern got a Kern Family Foundation grant while I was there, and it was right after that I started seeing more of the social justice stuff. So I don't know how much of a connection there is, but there seems to be possibly one. There's a correlation at least. There's old-fashioned liberalism in some of our seminaries as well. Russell Fuller exposed this at Southern. He exposed the teachings of Dominic Hernandez and teaching mythology in the Old Testament, that the inspired writers basically made errors. Postmodernism, Jonathan Pennington at Southern, in a book called Reading the Gospels Wisely, promotes the horizons approach to interpreting Scripture, where it's not objectively true. It's when the interpreter and the horizon of the interpreter and the horizon of the writer meet, then you have meaning created. So you when you read something, you're having an effect on the thing you're reading. It's not just trying to glean what it says, but you yourself are bringing in this whole context of your experience into the interpretation, and that changes the meaning. We have soft pedaling of LGBT happening as well in certain arenas. This one is a little harder to trace, but you have Karen Swallow Pryor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's endorsed endorsed Revoice theology, the Revoice movement, and the Revoice movement is the same-sex attracted Christianity, that you can be homosexual, you can live culturally homosexual, you can, as long as you don't participate in the physical the bonding, then you're not in sin. As long as you don't do what the Bible says not to do in that sense, you can be a Christian homosexual, right? That's kind of, in a nutshell, Revoice theology. And so she's endorsed this kind of thing. In fact, when I was at Liberty University, before she moved to Southeastern, she came out with a book called Cultural Engagement. And in the beginning of the book, she says that all the people that are contributing are Orthodox believers. Well, one of them was a guy named Matthew Vines, and his whole chapter is how actually you can be a Christian homosexual and act on it. And that's perfectly fine. I guess he's an Orthodox Christian. And that was against Liberty University's code of conduct, and yet she's doing book signings on campus. And now she's in the Southern Baptist Convention, she's at Southeastern. And these things have been called out, by the way. All the things I'm mentioning, these have all been exposed. These have all been confronted. These have all been called out. You have Nate Collins, who really started the Revoice movement. His dissertation is from Southern Seminary. He taught at Southern Seminary. He talked about, I believe his dissertation was on gender, too. You have Russell Moore saying, and he's not in the convention anymore, but when he was at the URLC said, I wouldn't go to a gay wedding, but I'd go to a gay wedding reception. You have Robert Oscar Lopez getting fired from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary because he would share his testimony about being saved from homosexuality, and now Jesus changing him to a point that he has a wife and kids, and apparently that offended the ERLC, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary said, you can't go share that story without approval from us first. Robert Lopez said, it's my testimony, I'm going to share it. He was fired. There's so much, like I said, that could be said. We have soft complementarianism coming in. And in some places, egalitarianism when it comes to gender roles in the church. Soft complementarianism, the effort to separate the role of a pastor from the function of a pastor. So that you can, as long as you're not the pastor, you can still go up and preach to a mixed audience. That's fine, of men and women. As long as you don't have that role of being an elder, you can still preach. So you can take the function of an elder and separate it from the role. Danny Aiken has teased ideas like this. There was a recording that a student just recorded and then exposed where he talked about this in class. Of course, Southeastern changed their policy right after that. You can't record in class anymore. In fact, there's little things like this. Like, at Southeastern, I don't know if it's still the case, but the chairman of the board for the school was a female. And they had a number of members who are females on the board. Now, you might think that's not a big deal, but it's not a far jump to go from that, where you have an institution for training pastors, females making the decisions for that institution, to why don't we just have female pastors then? It's a temporary holding position that won't be able to hold up for long. In fact, they now have people graduating with degrees in pastoral ministry, MDivs, who are women from Southeastern. J.D. Greer, who was president of the Southern Baptist Convention until last year, talked about breaking down hierarchies, welcoming Beth Moore after John MacArthur basically scolded her for, you shouldn't be preaching to men, and J.D. Greer said, we'll accept you. So this kind of thing is also happening in the convention. And then there's corruption. And like I said, false teaching and corruption go hand in hand. You have Ed Litton, who is the current president of the convention, and the plagiarism scandal that he couldn't avoid because so many people kept finding him preaching sermons verbatim from other people like Tim Keller and J.D. Greear that he took credit for. You have the fact that church starts have plummeted to less than half the number before 2010, while the North American Mission Board's church planting budget has exploded, growing from $23 million to $75 million. How is that possible? How is it the North American Mission Board has all this finances when church plants are tanking? In fact, Give.org rates the Clinton Foundation and Planned Parenthood as more transparent than the North American Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. Planned Parenthood is more open. $60 to $70 million has been shifted in the last 10 years from SBC state conventions and local associations to the SBC itself, most of it going to the North American Mission Board. That's a centralizing tendency. There's a lot of local state conventions and associations. A lot of that money is being now taken from the state conventions, and then this is the result of the Great Commission resurgence, 2010, and it's being given now to NAM, to a top-down centralizing authority. That's very powerful now. There are many stories that I've heard about corruption, and there's golden parachutes, and there's people rewarding other people. Most of that has not been made public. There's one, though, that I can tell you, this is one story of many. Tom Rayner, I believe this was 2 years ago, he was receiving a weekly income of $225,000 from Lifeway. He was in charge of Lifeway. That store that used to exist that had 170 of them across the country, and they all shut down in 2019. So you would think not a very good leader of Lifeway, yet he left Lifeway with a $1 million bonus. And the person who authorized that bonus was a trustee of Lifeway, Jimmy Scroggins. Tom Rayner, and Jimmy Scroggins, by the way, secured a 3-book deal with Lifeway during Rayner's time. You also have the fact that Tom Rayner was in a partnership with the North American Mission Board. At the time, he was the president of Lifeway. He was part of that was called the Revitalize Network, and he had a church answers ministry he was also part of, which was SBC. So he had 3 different SBC entities he was involved with or drawing checks from. That's conflict of interest galore. That kind of thing is happening all over the place. And that's just a little peek into why people have asked the question, how come the boards can't hold these people accountable? That's one of the reasons. Go watch online Tom Rushes, who is a trustee at Southern Seminary. He gives testimony for why he's a trustee there, why he can't get anything done on the trustee board, because they're all picks. They're of Al Mohler and the people that run the seminary. They can't get anything done because of that. There's 5,258 fewer churches, this is 2019 numbers, by the way, it's a lot more now, that support the cooperative program than there was in 2007. It's a decrease of $85.1 million, not including inflation. Now, that's an alarming figure. There's 100,000 souls a year that declining in baptisms. That's the decline of baptisms every year, 100,000 less from 2007 to 2019. And yet, if you go to a convention, you're going to get the idea that just everyone's becoming a Christian and the Southern Baptists are out there doing a good job. Now, some have asked, and I should probably just say this, because this is a very common question, is what about Al Mohler? And I had this question at first. He has a lot of influence in the convention. Can't he do something? And I'll just briefly bring you through a few things with Al Mohler. Al Mohler, this is the conclusion I've come to, is just a political animal. He's an opportunist. Because I can't figure out what he believes on hardly anything. He'll say one thing one time and another thing another time. He changed his position on homosexual orientation and conversion therapy in 2014. He actually publicly apologized for the years that he said there wasn't a homosexual orientation. He believes that Southern Baptists, he said this in 2018, are guilty of a sinful absence of historical curiosity because they ignore the racism and the stain of racism in their denomination, which he said will never go away until Christ comes. He said that in 2019, that the stain of racism will never go away until Christ comes. He characterized the United States as conceived in racism and that it affected every structure in the United States. That's 2020. He connected the shootings of Michael Brown and Breonna Taylor to police racism. He signed the statement on George Floyd. He insinuated the phrase Black Lives Matter is acceptable. He did not sign the Dallas Statement on social justice because it approved of white supremacy. He opposed critical race theory in the abstract after Resolution 9, yet defended the motives of the Resolutions Committee. He was the one who hired and defended Curtis Woods, Jarvis Williams, and Matthew Hall. He defended Danny Aiken and Adam Greenway, presidents of Southwestern and Southeastern, on social justice issues, yet he declined to defend Founders Ministries, the Conservative Baptist Network, or John MacArthur on social justice issues when they're attacked. He approved of condemning the Southern Cross and retiring the Brodus Gavel. He approved of Russell Moore's performance while Moore was pushing the needle left, and he was exposed by Russell Fuller and Tom Rush. And yet today, what you'll hear from him is he's against critical race theory and always has been. And he'll have people on his program to talk about it. And this is the kind of thing you're getting in the Southern Baptist Convention, which is why it's so confusing. Seminaries have issued statements condemning critical race theory, but then they don't get specific. It just says, well, we just think the Bible should be is supreme authority, not critical race theory. Well, that's what Resolution 9 said. Critical race theory has to be condemned as false teaching. That's a bridge too far. They're not willing to do that. So one last thing I want to share with you before I wrap it up is the IMB. This is the biggest reason Southern Baptists stay in the Southern Baptist Convention is the IMB, the International Mission Board. You say, okay, theological schools could be bad. The North American Mission Board might be corrupt and bad, but you know what? There's all these missionaries out there, and we don't want to pull the rug out from under them. Now, I've talked to a lot of missionaries with the IMB, and I can't share any of what they've told me with you because they've all signed NDAs, and they're not allowed to share anything publicly about the IMB. I'm pretty convinced, if half of what I've heard is true, that the IMB might be more corrupt than some of the others. Well, let me give you some publicly available stuff. And that's not just on false teaching, that's also on just corruption. The International Mission Board is the most cherished agency of the Southern Baptist Convention. In 2020, they boasted 3,500 field workers and 144,000 conversions. Some churches aware of compromise within the seminaries in NAM are reluctant to pull out because of this. And there's less publicly available evidence of theological drift because it's hard to find the information. It's not as readily accessible. But an unearthing of corruption and compromise is gradually making its way to the surface. In 2017, the president of the IMB, Paul Chitwood, publicly endorsed the CRT-influenced book, Removing the Stain of Racism, from the Southern Baptist Convention, calling it a work Southern Baptists needed for handling the sin of racism. Chitwood also signed the Southern Baptist Statement of the Death of George Floyd, which linked the death of Floyd to racial inequality and distribution of justice in our country. During the BLM protests in June of 2020, Chitwood told the IMB staff they must lament for the sins of systemic racism. He then bemoaned the pain, trauma, and hate African-American members of the IMB endured and pledged to work harder to diversify the organization, talk more about systemic racism, and empower minorities. Later that month, Chitwood also pledged to put more resources into representing the interests of Asian Americans in response to racism affecting their community related to COVID-19. Later that year, Chitwood started making good on his promises. In September 2020, he sent an email to staff expressing his intentions to avoid racism in the agency by targeting people of color for recruitment, implementing unconscious bias and sensitivity training, creating a separate private communication channel for Black, African American, or biracial staff, and developing a similar network for Hispanic employees celebrating Juneteenth and Hispanic Day, and then praying to end racial injustice. Now, in case you didn't catch that, unconscious bias training and then support groups that are exclusive to certain races. I mean, segregation, okay? That's what we're talking about. Segregating off African Americans, Hispanic people to be in their own little club in the IMB. And then if you have two people who are equally qualified for a job and one's, let's say, white and one's a minority, hiring the minority. That's what he's talking about here. And then unconscious bias training. So that's what some of you get at your jobs. In October 2020, the IMB hosted a summit on the future of missions that specifically focused on the importance of ethnic minorities and women in carrying out the goal of diversifying the church. Though Christian missions, by definition, has always concentrated on different cultures, an underlying assumption of the panel on biblical diversity was that something lacked in the IMB. Since Revelation 7:9 describes God's people as from every tribe, tongue, and nation, it was important to do things like include diverse cultural perspectives that together produce better interpretations of the Bible. Standpoint theory. Favor different cultures in church hiring processes, allocate church money towards meeting the needs of different kinds of people, and listen to diverse voices. This reorientation from seeking to evangelize and disciple all people on the basis of their need for Christ, regardless of gender or ethnicity, to instead pursuing diversity as an end in and of itself, continues in the agency to this day. That's the key. That's the shift. It's not, I think a lot of us have heard this and we're like, I have no problem with being more diverse. You're missing it if that's what you're hearing. What we have to hear is we're changing the whole goal and the whole mission of this organization. It's a shift from we're going to reach everyone with the gospel to we need to look this certain way as an end in and of itself, or else we're racists. That's what they're doing. In December 2020, a student embarking on an IMB-sponsored missions trip revealed a list of books recommended by the IMB in order to prepare spiritually before departure. Among the books were Dottie Lewis's Among Wolves, Unleashed by Eric Mason, and Gospel by D.A. Horton. Now get this. These are books the IMB thinks that'd be good to learn. These would be good to read before you go on a missions trip. Lewis, his assessment was that we are all practicing bigots, that the slogan "Make America Great Again" signals support for racism, and that Jim Crow laws in people in society's hearts have yet to be abolished. So you can see parallels of critical race theory there. And Eric Mason, likewise attributes the current cultural crisis and deep racial divide in the church to suspicion resulting from Jim Crow, the war on drugs, and racial profiling. Similarly, D.A. Horton describes white Christians in the suburbs as fearful and incompetent to evangelize minorities without learning how to communicate using tools like eubonics. That's right, you got to go, he has a eubonics dictionary in his book. That's what the IMB thought would be good for you to learn. You learn some eubonics before you go in the hood so you can communicate the gospel. I kid you not, it's almost funny. I was almost laughing reading some of the things in there. Because at one point he talks about snitching. That, if you understand the concept of snitching in the ghetto, you'll understand the gospel, because snitching is when, when you decide to turn someone in who's guilty for a crime. But if you don't snitch and you take the penalty yourself and say, I'm guilty when you're not, that's like what Jesus did. I kid you not. That's the kind of thing the IMB thinks will help you. Public accusations of corruption are more common toward the IMB than accusations of theological compromise, though. When former IMB president David Platt resigned his position in 2018, he said the agency was sick. Let me read for you what David Platt said. Quote, "I hate the politics of the SBC. And I don't say that as an outsider, I say that as an insider. These last 4 years, some of the lowest points in my leadership have been when I found myself participating in them, jockeying for position, continual self-promotion, backroom deals, followed by spin in the front room. Strategizing like brothers are your enemy, feeling like others see you as their enemy, getting to the point where you wonder if you can trust anyone, even as you start to wonder how trustworthy you've become." Now, David Platt is a practitioner of social justice. This is what he said the IMB was like. Jackson Wu, an IMB worker who trained Chinese pastors in East Asia, recently left the agency in part over what he called a reputation for manipulation and bully tactics. Wu highlighted specific examples of authoritarianism, greed, secrecy, and lying. Most notable were his revelations that the IMB reported 10 times the actual number of pastors he trained and inflated the number of unreached people groups. Wu also revealed one of the potential barriers preventing other whistleblowers. In order to receive retirement money, the IMB required missionaries to sign a non-disclosure agreement when exiting the field. By the way, all those missionaries who came off the field because the IMB forced them to get the jab, even if their kids are the age that they would be ready to go to college, if they don't sign the NDA, they don't get the funds to send their kids to college. Talk about an incentive to keep your mouth shut. That's why you haven't heard a lot of this. Now, the reason that this can't be confronted is because there's really two things that are popularly set out there. The popularity of Big Eva and the 11th commandment. They're responsible for the lack of accountability. Broadly speaking, the term Big Eva refers to an interconnected web of people and organizations forming an industry that supplies evangelicals with materials, services, and conferences. Phil Johnson, the executive director of Grace to You, called the desire to get the culture to love and appreciate us the defining mark of Big Eva. Because this industry often functions as a guild, unspoken rules such as the 11th commandment are thought to protect it from internal threats. One SBC pastor defines the 11th commandment as thou shalt not confront another big-name SBCer. Because guilds are capable of rewarding those who support them and punishing those who oppose them, incentives exist to extinguish or soft-pedal criticisms. Rarely will even ardent theological conservatives, I want you to hear me on this, ardent theological conservatives, people who would agree, rarely will you hear them ever describe social justice errors related to the gospel as false teaching. When was the last time you heard that the SBC has a false teaching problem? You won't even hear that from conservatives in the organization. Or withholding the term brother from prominent figures accused of heresy. This happens all the time with the conservatives. They will call people who are peddling the false teaching brothers. Now, the problem, ultimately, is the SBC has a broken immune system, in my mind. You see this with the opposition to the Conservative Baptist Network and the Founders documentary, By What Standard. You see this with Bobby Lopez, which I just talked about. You see this with Will McCraney. Did you know that the North American Mission Board is basically in litigation at the level of the Supreme Court right now? Any of you know that? It's kind of a big deal. No one talks about it. They are, though, because of the Will McCraney case. You might want to look into it. Anyone who says anything against the SBC is a slanderer or a racist or something bad. There's no way, though, that you can bring reform if that's the attitude you're met with. There's covering up of information. When Kern Family Foundation was exposed, they scrubbed it from the website. When I was doing a lot of podcasts on the Kingdom Diversity Initiative, like 90% of the Kingdom Diversity stuff went away overnight. This kind of stuff happens all the time. The inability last convention to repeal Resolution 9 is an example of this, where you had a number of people there at the convention floor to say, we want to repeal Resolution 9, and the Resolutions Committee would not let it happen. You also have fake apologies from the Resolutions Committee, from seminaries, from some of these professors I've mentioned, where they say things after the fact, well, I don't support CRT, or, I regret the way my words have been interpreted, things like that. Never an actual apology, though. So what are the right questions to ask? The right question, I don't think, is the SBC worth saving? That's the question that's being asked by a lot of conservatives. I want you to ask the question, is it worth saving? I think the right question to ask is it possible to save? Is it possible? Now, with God, I'm sure it is. But how long do you want to stay in an organization that does that is the question. And I've always been clear, I think there needs to be an exit strategy at some point. Say, all right, if things don't turn around, we can't keep funding this. And if we're not going to be involved, if we're not going to send messengers, then we can't keep an eye on things. There's no way we can fund this. Here's what 2 Corinthians 6:14-18 says. Do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship is light with darkness, or what harmony with Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Just as God said, I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean. And I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. We see in Matthew 18 the way to approach sin in the church. It says in Matthew 18:17, if a brother refuses to listen, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and tax gatherer. Now, the question you all have to ask if you're in an SBC church and you're considering this question is, what point of that process are we in? Or anything approximating that process? Has there been adequate time to correct these things? Has there been adequate movement towards correcting these things? Or is the immune system broken? And if the immune system's broken, then I think you probably have the answer to your question. Now, there is a convention coming up in June, and I hope some of you will maybe be messengers or representatives from some of your churches, if you're SBC, to go out there and try to turn things around. If it doesn't happen, though, you're going to have to think through how you want to, in the future years, navigate this. The good news, like I said at the beginning, is that God's kingdom is bigger than the SBC. God is still on the move. He's still saving people. He's still regenerating hearts, and that's a miracle. And I've seen that miracle, and many of you have too. And that doesn't stop just because a denomination goes downhill. This has happened throughout the history of the church. This is not a new thing. That's one of the things I want to say to you. This isn't new at all. There's always been false teaching. There's always been wolves. There's always been corruption. We should expect that, shouldn't we? That happened in the New Testament. It's always been there. And God has always also been at work. And he can use you, whether that's in the SBC or outside of the SBC. So I hope that was helpful to some of you in understanding some of the issues and specifically where they're located in the denomination. Do you want to close in a word of prayer? Should we do that? Or, okay, and then go to questions?